Okay, we are finishing our chapter on the Reformation. This is chapter 3. We're starting off on page 92 with the Church in the Pews, and we're going to finish this second half. It's been a bit of a break. If you are following along in real time, we took a Christmas break. So it's been a couple of weeks since we talked about the first part of the chapter. Obviously, if you're just watching these videos, then who knows? Maybe it's yesterday for all I know. But to briefly recap, we are in the Reformation. This is going to be basically around 1500, give or take. We are talking in this section about more of the practical personal level experiences of the Reformation Church rather than the geopolitical issues at play. That was really last time. The big ticket items, talking about Luther and his 95 Theses, talking about Calvin in Geneva or Zwingli, the individual historical figures. We talked about basically the breakdown of the church, capital C, meaning the Catholic Church in that sense, being kind of the universal connection. Okay, yeah, Zoom cut off again. So hopefully if this keeps happening, we might have to adjust, but we're back on. You don't have to tell me we froze. My screen actually disappears, so don't worry about
it. Okay, I wasn't sure.
Yeah. So the Catholic Church, the church in the West, has been the connective tissue throughout the Western world, certainly through Europe. Prior to this time, that has been in the process of breaking down. Obviously, the split between East and West, 1054 is the formal split, but they've been kind of growing apart now for a long time. But in the West, you have had the rise, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, of these city-states that have now kind of really, the tribes have formed nations. We're growing from a bunch of tiny feudal lords and properties to the amalgamation of those various feudal properties into larger, more culturally and linguistically united nations, oftentimes led by a singular king or ruling family. The Holy Roman Empire, the joke historically is it's none of those three things, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But regardless, you now have the church as more of a peer in these nations and with these rulers. The Pope is just basically like a fellow ruler rather than someone who was over and above all the other rulers and can kind of call any and all of them to task or to unity or cooperation or something. It's become a very politically fraught time where these various nations and kings are constantly jockeying for position. And that runs the gamut in relation to the church, from trying to have the church on your side, either for the blessings of your war or against your opponent or your enemy, to overtly fighting the church. This is the period of time leading into this and that kind of late Middle Ages where popes are being kidnapped and threatened, and there are alternate popes being named and consecrated anti-popes. So in this time of great fragmentation, it sort of settles here in the Reformation Renaissance era with these more formal nations and principalities, and the church is present in them all, but is still trying to figure out what its role is. It's no longer an overarching, unquestioned connection with the abuses of the church, with some of the sloppiness of its practices. The counter to those abuses will then lead into this fragmentation, a splintering. It starts with a break, and those breaks form cracks that then kind of split everything into pieces. The glass of a car window, for safety reasons, is tempered. That means it is, during its manufacturing process, it is heated and cooled in a certain fashion so as to remain under internal tension. Cars prior to, I don't know, maybe the 60s or so, had normal panes of glass. And whenever there was an accident, it's kind of like breaking a pane of glass in your house. Big jagged shards, and it was very dangerous. And even relatively small car accidents could result in some very serious injuries. So for safety purposes, I think this is all the way back into the 60s. It could be back in the 50s even. All the glass in cars was changed to this tempered glass, which, if you've had a broken glass window before, they're extra strong. So you can hit a car window and nothing happens. But if you do get a break in it, that internal tension, which serves to give it extra strength, also then shatters the glass in those little kind of fragments and like pebbles of glass. So like when you see broken automotive glass, it's like crumbled everywhere. You don't have like a big giant piece of it. It's that internal pressure that once the structure is broken, the whole thing just goes. So some of you know that I was a medic briefly before going to seminary, and so I had training in extrication from vehicles, like in a trauma or car accident. And so I remember a real fun extrication lab we got to do at the junkyard, where we learned how to cut apart cars as though there was somebody trapped. How do you get them out safely? How do you get them out quickly? The jaws of life, that kind of thing. And so on every first responding vehicle, and that's fire engines, fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, deputies' vehicles, whatever, they always carry this very tiny tool that looks about the size of a pin. And it's a little spring-loaded piston tool that breaks glass. And again, it looks like a ballpoint pen, and you pull back the little spring, and it's got a spring piston in there, and you place it up to the edge of the glass. If you put it in a corner, it usually works better, but you touch the glass with it, you press the button, and the spring hits this little thing. And again, it's like a flick, but it's because all of that force is in such a tiny little area. It hits the tempered glass, and then you can just kind of brush it away, because once it breaks under tension like that, there's really nothing holding it on, and you can just sort of push it, and the whole thing will just sort of crumble into those little nuggets of broken glass. That is a somewhat circuitous illustration to the nature of the breaking of the church during the Reformation. There's a lot of internal tension in the structure. There's a lot of stuff happening, whether it's the sale of indulgences, whether it's the aftermath of the Crusades, whether it is the popes and anti-popes and various nations and princes overtly arguing or pressuring the church into doing their own bidding, or just the state of clergy, which is at a pretty low level. There will always and have always been, and hopefully will always be, some exceptionally faithful, well-educated, diligent, and hardworking clergy, and there's always going to be some bums. Well, this period of time, there was a lot of bums. It was an industry. We mentioned this before, especially in the English church, but this is in a lot of continental European churches. You had clergy who were given those jobs because they were a younger son of a prominent family. So it had nothing to do with their faithfulness or piety, but if you were the third son of a, kind of a wealthy family or a slightly noble family, going to the clergy was your preferred option. The oldest son was the heir. And so they didn't have a job. Their job was to be the heir. And then the second son was often a military career. The third son, now you're starting to get pretty useless. So the most useless of them all were often shuffled off to the church. And again, that's not to say there weren't some very effective clergy, whether or not they were chosen in the proper fashion. God can use all sorts of material to bring about his goodwill. But it was also kind of a low point in the large number of priests and clergy who were just there for the paycheck, who were just there because you become kind of a minor noble yourself. You become a property owner, whatever it is. So this is kind of a low point of the church. There's that internal tension. And when one break happens, it doesn't split cleanly in half. The argument that Luther makes in the 95 Theses and, all this list of problems, this will be compared to in our section with Erasmus. Erasmus, the Erastian principle, where he is also a reformer, but Erasmus stays within the church. And they're basically happening at roughly the same time. And they will even argue with each other and send some pretty nasty letters to each other that we have preserved. And the insults are pretty dang ugly and sharp. But anyway, with this real need for reform, with these honest critiques and criticisms, when the split happens, when Luther basically says, I can't go back and I won't go back, and the church basically says, well, then, you are excommunicated and that's all there is to it. And it's kind of like having an argument where at some point either compromise or some level of cooperation is still possible until they both almost physically turn their backs to each other and you can kind of feel some kind of door close. In that moment, if we want to talk about like a pane of glass breaking, it doesn't really break like normal glass. It more breaks like the tempered glass of a car. That's not instant. There's a period of time where you kind of have two choices. You're a Catholic or you're a Lutheran, but it doesn't take long before not just different people, different theologians, different leaders start saying, well, I disagree with you too. And I disagree so fundamentally that I'm going to turn my back on you and you're going to turn your back on me. And now that split turns into a split and those splits start splitting and so on and so forth. That begins to happen relatively soon. But also remember, these nation states are looking for ways to keep themselves together and to be set apart from the alternative. What makes us French versus Swiss? What makes us English versus Welsh? What makes us Prussian You know, these things are kind of churning around. You have, for instance, Spain, which used to hold land all throughout different pockets of Western Europe. When Holland breaks off from the Spanish Empire and the creation of those newly free states into the United Netherlands, one of the early things they do is toss out Roman Catholicism. Now, is that because they were enormously pious in this one particular direction? Maybe, but it's just as likely, if not both at the same time, where this was a way to distinguish themselves from their former Spanish conquerors. They are Roman Catholic. We are not. So these nation states are now finding ways to adopt some of these splits in their favor. Because now we can have a French church, we can have a Dutch church, we can have an English church. And number one, that's different than these other nations that we're kind of rivals with. And it helps us, you know, stay united and stay feeling like there's a common identity. But if you have a church that's either unique to your country or is predominant in your country, well, who do you think's in charge? Most likely that king, most likely that regent or ruling family or whatever. And what king is going to give up the opportunity to gain a little more authority or control? So those are the things that have led us to this position. We even talked about the English Reformation, which was shaped differently in many ways than what happened on the continent. I even gave you kind of the 5-minute rundown on why Henry VIII gets kind of a bad rap. Not that he was a good guy. He did plenty of really rotten things. And especially later in his life, he seemed to be kind of a crummy guy. But the whole, well, he just wanted a divorce and that's why he got his own church is not just an oversimplification. It really completely ignores the practical political realities that led to that. That this wasn't just a lusty fat guy that, you know, again, in the quickest terms possible, he was exactly one generation removed from the War of the Roses, which tore the nation apart, resulted in probably tens of thousands of deaths, and could have destroyed England as a whole. It was his father, Henry Tudor, who actually won the War of the Roses and settled this long-standing dispute that all comes from what? It comes from who is the legitimate heir from a king who has no older son left. So anything else that Henry VIII does, any of his other rationales, any of his other kind of bad reasons, can't ever be completely separated from that exceptionally practical one. And a very similar situation had happened in another nation at almost the exact same time period. The Pope granted that annulment. Then again, the Pope was surrounded at the time by an army from that nation. So maybe the Pope gave them a different level of consideration. But anyway, I mean, that's kind of where we're living right now. That's a time period where even the legitimacy of the church is being undermined by its own problems. Internal pressure, here comes the break, and and I think this was one of my theology professors, but it might have been my church history professor at seminary. He basically said in the Reformation, we removed one pope and replaced him with a million. That is the outgrowth, in a sense, is every man a pope. Who is the supreme authority of your religion? And the answer is, well, I guess you are. Because even if you submit yourself to, like, oh, I'm a Methodist, so the Book of Order is my jam, or I'm a Roman Catholic and I listen to what the Pope says. I mean, you can pick anything you want, but guess what? The question has already been answered by the way that I formulated the statement. You picked. The fact that you are choosing like a consumer means you are the ultimate authority. And we can argue that that is in some ways right and well and good. That respects the dignity of every human being and, you know, made in the image of God and ultimately responsible for our own relationship with the Lord and all that kind of stuff. But it is to say it is now fundamentally different from here on out. Anytime you go from a default setting to a choice, something fundamental has changed. And so what starts off as one very clear break isn't the pane of glass with one jagged shard. It is the tempered glass, and it's in a million pieces now. And the individual people in the pews are the ones then who have now found themselves in the position of Pope. They are looking at a pile of glass fragments, the little glass nuggets of the broken car window, and basically they're now picking out their favorite one. And that's different. It's never happened before quite in that way. Now, that's not to say that the choice is absolute or that it's as obvious and easy as I'm making it out to be. You know, if you were a French peasant and the ruling area switched from Roman Catholic to Huguenot, well, you might just find yourself at a Huguenot church the next week and there's nothing you can do about it. And then when it switched back a generation later, you were suddenly a Roman Catholic again and nothing you can do about it. I'm being kind of fast and loose with a lot of the implications, as though, you know, everyone had complete knowledge of everything and they could, you know, they could Google their favorite denomination and then just find that particular church. I mean, that's not really the case, especially in the early times of the Reformation. But again, there being a choice was very different. And that same desire for a unifying factor within a particular nation with the culture, like, you know, we speak this language and we are this faith, comes with its own complications. You know, how do you tell your nation of 1 million people that everything that they have been raised in is now potentially different? You know, when I talk to Roman Catholics and they ask about the Episcopal Church, one of the things that usually gets mentioned is, well, the services are very similar. The liturgies, the prayers, the structure, even if the order is slightly different or some of the wording is different, I think you would feel like it's very familiar. So when these Reformation changes are happening within a nation, sometimes it's going to look very familiar. You know, maybe all they're doing is taking down a painting of the Pope and putting up a painting of the King. I don't know. It's, you know, some of these changes are not flipping a switch night and day. It's radically different. Sometimes the people might not even realize everything has changed around them because the changes are relatively subtle in a manner that you would see, you know, just showing up to church on a Sunday or whatever. But sometimes they were more substantial. And, you know, being told that you are now a Lutheran instead of a Catholic, well, maybe you didn't want to be a Lutheran. Maybe you were somebody who actually had an opinion about this. Well, what happens when your decision about your faith is now connected to your national identity? Because remember, like, let's say the Dutch, we're split off from Spain, we are independent now, and we are Protestant. That's what it means to be Dutch, is to, you know, be a Protestant. But you come from a faithful Roman Catholic family, and the sort of things that they're telling you to do, you don't want to do. No, I'm a Roman Catholic. Well, does that mean you're not Dutch anymore? Does that mean that you are opposed to being Dutch? Does that mean you're opposed to our government? Does that mean you're our enemy? Like, suddenly this is now, your religious affiliation is now interlinked with your political affiliation in a way that is different than it used to be. you could be a faithful Roman Catholic in any nation of Europe, and it was just sort of understood that where you lived was not the sum total of who you were, and that as Scripture itself teaches, that our citizenship is in heaven. Regardless of where we live, we have a permanent, eternal home. Well, suddenly, if your whole nation and your sovereign, your king, your whoever, it has changed religious affiliation, and they really want this as a unifying factor within that kingdom or country or whatever, what does it mean for you to say no? Because now you're not just saying no to somebody inviting you to come to this church rather than this church. You're basically making a statement about where you stand in this country, or where you stand in relation to its government or its decisions or even its cultural identity. So that used to be preserved for one feudal lord versus another feudal lord. Which family are you affiliated with? Because we might fight, kind of like the English War of the Roses. Are you a Yorkist, or do you support the Lancasters? But now something as simple as your church maybe removed all of the saints one Sunday, and you showed up and there were no more candles, no more crucifixes, and no more saints. And well, that's different. Maybe I heard the next town over still has that, so I will walk. Well, now all of a sudden, maybe that's subversive. Maybe you are marking yourself as an enemy to the king. You're now on the other side because of that. And the unfortunate truth is, we will have a good 200 or 300 years of this extremely sticky mixing and matching of religious and political affiliations, resulting in violence, warfare, persecution, execution, all this kind of stuff. The history of England from the 1500s to the 1700s is replete with the Roman Catholics versus Church of England. Who's in charge? Who is persecuting and executing whom? You will find sources. Fox's Book of Martyrs, for instance, a very famous, relatively primary source from this time period, which will list a lot of the English martyrs, especially under Queen Mary, Bloody Mary. This is like William Tyndale being burned at the stake kind of stuff. Well, once Elizabeth is in power, well, there's a bunch of Roman Catholics who were executed too, because it's treasonous to be an overt Roman Catholic, depending on your position in court, or who you are, or whatever it is. Because Elizabeth is not a Roman Catholic, and she's a Protestant monarch, and yada yada yada. So that's going to be the closest to our history, because we have a little more direct relationship there. But that's happening all over Europe. That sort of conflict is happening all over Europe. And it's going to happen even between various Protestants. Luther has some sharp words for other people, not just Roman Catholics. And some of these letters exist. And man, he is just a potty mouth at times. There will be plenty of theological disputes between the more, the further you go in Reform and in Protestantism, the Zwingli and the Anabaptists, those who are saying that baptism is only for adult, public, mature proclamation. and any baptism prior to that is invalid, has to be done again. You know, these are being now, you're having not just spirited debate. You know, you are having real fights. You are having warfare over theological disagreements. And to some degree, you say, well, that's always happened. Yeah, but it seems so sharp over this time period as each of these new Protestant faiths are kind of both jockeying for position and also maintaining their distinction between themselves. You know, when the Augsburg Confession is written by Melanchthon, and it's kind of codifying Lutheranism. That's going to be both emulated, and it's also going to be disputed with some of the things that Zwingli will write, or some of the Anabaptists who will say there are no creeds and there are no statements of faith. To make a statement of faith is a work of man, and we can't do that. Same thing with the 39 Articles. The 39 Articles of Anglicanism are going to borrow from that, but then they're going to like very purposefully stand in opposition on a couple of places, because each of these become a way to make yourself distinct from the people and the church and the churches who are not you. Still kind of feels like we're talking about the big picture stuff, but it's kind of hard to talk about how this is affecting you in the pews without, you know, kind of thinking through. You are just sort of at the whim of what's happening around you to a large degree. And even when you do have the option, your options are now linked with political consequences. Now, interestingly, and I think this makes a lot of intuitive sense if you think about it, this also became a time of very intense personal devotion and piety and faith. You know, during the Reformation, you now have, well, if we need to reject the overarching authority of the Roman Catholic Church, and we want people, you know, priesthood of all believers and justified by faith, and they need to be able to, you know, encounter Christ for themselves and understand the ways in which, you know, maybe the Catholic faith is wrong, or if you're a Lutheran, what the Calvinists have wrong, or whatever. Well, then they need a Bible to read. And then having the Bible written in their language becomes a huge deal in the early Reformation. You know, we don't have the Bible in English until people like William Tyndale. And this is happening in the very early 1500s. To translate into a vulgar language, which is funny because there was a time when Latin was the vulgar language. That's where Vulgate comes from. St. Jerome's Vulgate was taking the Greek New Testament and the Greek Septuagint, Old Testament, and rewriting it in Latin, because that was the common language of the empire, or of, you know, that was the language that more people knew. That was the lingua franca. Well, now translating the Latin into French or into German or into English is now fraught with peril. And the church resisted that for a long time. And again, I just want to say there's a benefit of the doubt to some degree. There's no machine or formula that allows one language to perfectly translate into another. You are always making choices and decisions where one word in one language means, like, these 3 or 4 words are all kind of roughly similar, but there's not one that exactly captures. Well, then how do you choose? You have to choose. You try to use your best judgment, maybe your scholarly experience, maybe hopefully your prayerful devotion. But again, this is another seminary professor telling me this is an old maxim. None of us invented this. Every translation is treason. You know, you're always making mistakes. and you're always making choices that somebody could dispute. So if you are rewriting the words of Scripture into another language, how do we know you didn't screw it up? How do we know not just an inadvertent mistake or an arguable point? Maybe you wrote things on purpose to kind of manipulate people. When you read most modern English translations of the New Testament, most of them, in talking about, in saying the book of Acts or whatever, or in the Pauline epistles, will refer to overseers and elders. Yeah, that word is episkopos. And the other word is presbyteros. Bishop and presbyter or priest. So if you are writing in the Reformation something to give, the people like the Bible in their own language for the first time, but you are overtly trying to get them to separate from Rome, you never write the word bishop. On purpose. You have to come up with a new description, because calling something a bishop is too close to say, listen to what the Roman Catholic Church wants you to do. So we have to have a discontinuity between the Roman Catholic Church and the early church. So we're going to use different terms. Now, is elder or overseer, and is it wrong? No, it actually isn't. It's not an inappropriate, but it is a purposeful change. And in the context of when they changed it, there was a reason why. And that reason wasn't so great. That reason was, we need you to know that you ought to be different than them. That's kind of a big deal. And that's not to say that if every translation used bishop and priest, that we would all be one happy family. It is just to say that some of these choices, while they are very defensible in context, there are reasons that they were changed that are maybe less than admirable, and maybe more about making a rhetorical point based off of when it was written. Some of the 39 articles are very pointed to arguments they were having at the moment. And we can look back at them and say, I don't get it. What are you so upset about? That seems like not that much of a difference to me. And I think we're right and we're wrong in saying that some of these things aren't that big of a deal. I think the concept, and this is a New Testament concept of adiaphora, that which is non-essential. That we can and should have charity with each other about the non-essentials. Of course, trying to decide what's essential and not essential makes choices in and of itself. But there were some of these arguments that people were willing to lay down their lives for. Thomas Cranmer, who was the primary author of the Book of Common Prayer, under political duress, under imprisonment and torture, recants the Reformation, and then rejects his recanting and says, no, even though I wrote that I'm really sorry and I made a mistake, I didn't make a mistake, and I can do no other, is one of his famous lines. And the story of his execution, because now it's a political statement to no longer be a Roman Catholic, and this is under Queen Mary, Bloody Mary. He is burned at the stake. And as the story goes, he shoves his right hand, the hand that signed the recantation, into the flames first, so that hand would suffer the consequences first, because he was disgusted at his cowardice to recant his truth, whatever. I'm just saying that these were so vociferously held. I think we do some of these martyrs to the faith a disservice by shrugging our shoulders to say, what's the big deal? And I'm not suggesting that it's right to burn people at the stake over should there be 7 sacraments or 2 dominical ordinances. What I am saying is we can maybe try to understand their context and why at the time they genuinely believed this was a matter of worthy of life and death. And to some degree, there is something quite admirable about the seriousness of faith that says these things that we do on a Sunday morning genuinely do echo through eternity. The matters of salvation are not just matters of life and death, they are matters of eternal consequence. So we ought to get them. It is important to get them right. That is a very, complicated situation. But again, if we're talking about the people in the pews, that's sort of where they're living. They are now faced with some of this stuff for the very first time. And there is an explosion of devotion and faith and piety as you would only feel like for the first time, you get to read the Bible in a language that you understand. Because a lot of people didn't understand Latin anymore. That was no longer the lingua franca. That was no longer the common language. Latin was now a scholarly language. By the 15th and 16th century, Latin was the language of scholars, nobility. You had to be purposefully educated in it. You were considered pretty smart, that kind of thing. So your average person, if they could read it all, you're talking about whatever common language that they grew up speaking. And so to have the scriptures that you could read for your own, to be preached in your own language, to be in a service where you didn't just stand and kneel because you recognized a rhythm or pattern or a bell rang, but you were following along and you could hear it and understand it. And when something that was said was that dramatic or was that holy, you responded because you understood. Well, that's an enormous difference. We take it for granted that we all understand our services. We take it for granted that we can pick up a Bible at any time. We take it for granted that we can look on our phones and not just call up a Bible verse, but we can call up dozens of translations within seconds. And all of this is brand new. And because, and now we've got the inventions of the Renaissance, like a printing press. So now we actually have material that can be printed and distributed relatively cheaply. And so not just is the Bible going to be written in English, but you might actually see one of these things. Because they're not millions of dollars for a book. So again, we are dealing with the ramifications of, man, I'm a farmer and I am doing my best to raise my family in the fear of the Lord and to do my duty to God through Sabbath observance or through almsgiving or whatever. But I find that everything is changing around me. And if we can imagine ourselves in that position, that's a pretty big set of changes to try to navigate. And this is where we are, working through this last section. But again, there is a renaissance, a rebirth of popular piety and devotion because people are now able to engage and interact within a church service, within a Bible study, within the feast or festival in a way that they really hadn't been able to prior. And that you can just imagine that is kind of an exciting opportunity and people avail themselves of that. And, the great things that can happen when everything to that point has been just an assumption. You are raised in the church. These are the things you do because this is what you're supposed to do. And then suddenly it's become a matter of personal responsibility. No, I want you to understand this. I want you to accept this. I want you to feel this. And then maybe these are things for the first time that you're having to encounter on that very intimate personal level. The response from Rome is mainly through the Council of Trent, what is sometimes referred to as a counter-reformation. Trent seeks to firm up the Catholic Church's position. We get a little more about Trent in this book, again, because it is from a Catholic perspective, than I think you might get in a different church history book over this same period of time. But it is worth noting. The Council of Trent, or the Tridentine response, is basically it's basically the Catholic Church responding to the Protestant Reformation, and both there is some acknowledgement of problems and some solutions to that, but then there's also a very strong reassertion. But this is the real truth. This is who we are. This is what it means. And this is how far you're setting yourself outside of it by doing all this other stuff. And so it kind of cements everyone's position being kind of in opposition to one another. So Trent, which could have been, let's find common ground, let's accept these criticisms or whatever, really becomes a way for Roman Catholicism to kind of solidify its current footing. Trent does a lot of good in cleaning up some messes, but Trent also builds walls and pours cement that is going to make sure that there is no reconciliation within the Reformation. It makes it kind of a permanent state of affairs. The funny thing is, when we talk about church history in these terms, everything is in the West. The East does not have a Reformation. Orthodoxy never has a Reformation like this. Orthodoxy has their own problems, don't get me wrong. Like, it's just different. And the funny thing is, Orthodoxy is kind of perpetually confused by the whole thing. They don't like the Roman Catholics because that represents all of the old history of being taken advantage of, taking too much authority and power, causing the split, blah, blah, blah. But they also don't like the Protestants because, well, now you guys are just making junk up. And some of your stuff is just crazy. It didn't make any sense at all. So when we talk about church history over this period of time, everything is very, very European, Western church, Luther versus the Pope kind of stuff. But just to keep in the back of our pockets that there is still an Eastern church, and it's in multiple pieces. That's where the East has its own issues. What they refer to as autocephalous, meaning its own head. So the Greek Orthodox Church is not the Russian Orthodox Church, is not the Armenian Orthodox Church. And those guys can all fight amongst each other too. And they were constantly excommunicated and anathematizing each other and whatever. But there remained an essential unity of Orthodox theology and practice that carried them all the way through the 15, 16, 1700s. So as Europe was breaking into a million different denominations, Orthodoxy remains extremely stable. They are very, not just nationally oriented, they're very ethnically oriented, but that's where all of their all their arguments are all ethnic arguments. The theology is pretty much stable within them all. The issue is just like, I'm Greek and you're Russian, so I hate you. So people in the pews, it's both a very confusing time, a potentially dangerous time, but also in the terms of their own faith, a very exciting time. I can read the Bible. I can go to a church where the preaching feels authentic and emotional and connects to me. I am making responsible choices for myself and for my family about how we can and ought to relate to God. And these are all, it's obviously a very mixed bag. But it is a very, it's a very unique and it's a very energetic time within the life of the church for people who are just like everyday people. They're not princes and principalities making these big decisions or making these splits or writing their theses or whatever. They're just trying to make sense of the world and their lives. They're trying to raise their children. They are trying to work out their salvation with fear and trembling, while everything else around them is sometimes changing without any say on their part. I mean, some of these changes are going to be pretty dramatic. When the English Civil War erupts, this is now in the 1600s. This is Oliver Cromwell and Parliament fighting King Charles and the loyalists. And this is very much the divine right of kings. We're both Protestant, but King Charles is much more in the very formal liturgical Protestantism, and Cromwell and the Protestants, Cromwell and Parliament are in the very, very low church, almost Calvinistic Protestants. And so they fight and they are trying to toss each other out completely. So you could literally go to your local parish church and show up, and all of the candlesticks have been smashed, because candlesticks is a sign of Rome. Now, they weren't Roman, they were Church of England, but because the Church of England had a formal liturgy and the parliamentary Roundheads wanted to have this very sparse low church Protestantism, well, all this stuff has to get thrown away. To be an iconoclast literally means someone who smashes or destroys icons. And that's what they did. Well, this is idolatry to have a crucifix instead of a cross, to try to represent the person of Christ in his body on the cross. And now you're worshiping a golden calf. We got to get rid of it. We're going to break. As a matter of fact, we can't just put it in a closet because you might sneak it out next week. We have to destroy it. So again, what happens when you go to church one Sunday and it looks one way, and you go to church the next Sunday and it looks totally different? And this will all, I'm not going to say it works itself out, but this is a flux that happens over the course of generations. And sometimes it takes big swings to one side, and then the pendulum swings back to the other. And sometimes it's relatively small within those swings, but it's still constantly happening. The turmoil, the tension, the flux. This is a phrase that has been repeated in other venues somewhat recently, but they are building the airplane while in flight. So it is, again, an energetic time. It's in many ways an exciting time in the pews, but it is also a time of confusion and turmoil. There's a lot of changes to be your average everyday Christian within the time of the Reformation. Many great and gracious possibilities are open to you. And yet, at the same time, because things are happening around you and to you outside of your control, it is also a time of great consternation and maybe not always knowing what's going to happen next. Anything else? Again, we're smushing together an awful lot of stuff. This is just this is more about giving you a taste of something so we can kind of have a sensation or a thought or a feeling in mind to try to get kind of a gist of this very, very wide, very, very complicated time frame. And again, to do it in a way that tries to connect it to the personal. I am not the president of the United States, and nobody in Congress gives a darn about my opinion on anything. But I still live with the consequences of decisions that are made in Washington and in the halls of Tallahassee and, on and on and on. So we live our faith. We worship within our congregation. We sit in our pews. We read our Bibles in our own rooms, but it's always within the context of some things that are happening around us that we really have little to nothing to have any kind of influence over. We just have to deal with it. Anything else? Yeah, it is a lot to take in. We will then go into the modern church next time. We will take that to page, it looks like 122, where we have a break for the church in the pews. So we'll have 2 more sessions, one where we talk about the modern church in kind of a big general historical sense, and then the last one in a couple of sessions where we will try to talk about, the changes of, the modern church for your average Christian.
Modern church to page 1.
I believe it's 122. People in the pews again. Okay. All right, we good? All right, well, thank you very much.
So we're doing this for a couple more times.
Yes. And then we'll be done. We'll need a new book. All right, thank you.